what was the thinking inside the Bank of Japan? You've been there. You've been a member of that board. What do you think they're grappling with at the moment? I mean, it was unanimous, 9-0.
Yes. So I think Bank of Japan was kind of sending a mixed signal for since September. They keep saying there's a distance from the 2% target. But at the same time, they started to send lots of, signal about possible normalization of monetary policy. And then perhaps because of this yen's depreciation, it was excessive yen's depreciation. So, they keep sending signal about this. But so market all expecting that the Bank of Japan will do some normalization next year. And then probably it's better to do it earlier. One, because if the Fed starts to lower interest rate, it might lead to the weakness of dollar and means appreciation yen. But probably better to do it earlier. Also, because right now Japan's inflation is quite high, above 2%, so it can be justified.
Okay, well, inflation has been high, but they still want to see if it's going to be higher for longer, that inflation, before they make a decision here. Also they're looking, of course, at the spring wage negotiations. So is April the month where they actually do something, or do you foresee something happening perhaps even earlier than that? People were, of course, foreseeing it, perhaps some, very few, today, but of course their hopes have been scuppered.
So, spring wage negotiation, everybody pay attention, and the governor also mentioned that. And then this spring wage negotiation ended up with an increase in 3.6% wage growth. But actual inflation, including small, medium enterprises, the nominal wage growth was just 1.4%. So actually lower than last year. So once we include small, medium enterprises, wages are not growing very fast. So I don't know, whether Bank of Japan can really justify, if in case we see an additional increase in wage growth for the next spring, because small, medium enterprises are really suffering, and then they are not in a position to able to increase the wages.
Sayuri-san, you mentioned in your notes, if the Bank of Japan normalizes monetary easing without clear evidence, the Bank of Japan may lose credibility as a central bank. Surely if they don't do anything here and leave it a longer and longer time, would they also then lose credibility too?
The difficulty about Bank of Japan is, after all, central bank's mandate is price stability, meaning achieving 2% in the longer run. So right now, over about 3 years, inflation will remain above 2%. So from that moment, probably it makes sense for BOJ to normalize it. But the current inflation is nothing to do with demand-driven. It's almost all come from food. 70 to 80% come from food, and the yen's depreciation. So it's kind of cost push. So it's not sustainable. Bank of Japan knows it. So, and also market participants know that. So maybe after 3 years, inflation will come down below 2%. And that is also precisely what BOJ project. So if that is so, then they also have some difficulty. So right now, it makes sense to normalize monetary policy, but because of this is cost push and not the demand-driven wage price virtuous cycle, then what BOJ is going to do if after that, inflation started to go down. By the way, on December 5th, the Bank of Japan showed a preliminary estimate about the impact of the past 10-year massive monetary easing on inflation. And they showed actually this 10-year massive inflation only increased the inflation by 0.7 percentage point. So which means they admit the monetary easing couldn't lead to the 2% inflation. Then BOJ is still committed to achieving 2%, right? So BOJ has to explain what are they going to do. I mean, they admit the massive monetary easing didn't really lead to the 2% inflation. Then they are going to normalize it, and then how are they going to explain that in a logical way?
So seriously, you're saying that they cannot justify monetary policy normalization given the inflation background, which is likely to show more benign inflation because of the cost push side of things. So therefore, they should have to justify why, after all these years, they've not been able to achieve that target. And secondly, maybe what they're doing, their medicine is entirely wrong, and they're getting it wrong. And it's like Einstein's definition of insanity, that if you keep on doing the same thing over and over again and hoping for a different result, that's the definition.
Yeah, I fully understand what you're saying, because Japan's demand is so weak. Consumption remained just a positive 0.5% in real sense over 23 years. So we never got constant demand-driven inflation. So that is a structural issue, right? And aging, and people do not consume because they worry about longevity. So it's a structural. So I'm saying, so we are likely to have a more cost-push type inflation in the future because of the severe labor shortage. So anyway, that leads to the higher wages. And because of labor shortage, we have a geopolitical risk and climate change. So inflation likely to stay higher than the past. Then, let's pay attention to the cost-push inflation. So monetary policy should be flexible to cope with that. That is the way I would talk. So, BOJ can change their inflation target rather than sticking to the 2%. They can introduce inflation target range, like 1.3%. And that flexibility makes sense. So I think it's very difficult for BOJ to stick to the idea of 2% based on demand-driven inflation. That didn't happen over 20 years.